Thank you, Ma'am Chair, and thank you, Acharya and Mr. Pulipaka, for giving me this opportunity. It's interesting that there are a couple of things that both Ms. Bagchi and Mr. Pulipaka flagged, which I think are important. The first one was the idea of cultural relativism and where we are coming from in terms of human rights, and secondly, non-traditional security concerns. I think that's a very important aspect of it, because it's how refugees are now being seen world over as a security concern, whereas traditionally they were never seen as one. So with that quick flag, I'll just move on. To give you a quick background, the problem of dubious categorization exists in like a few fields, and I'm going to talk about Australia since this summit is focused on Asia and Asia Pacific, and this presentation is going to be about how Australia categorizes refugees, what such categorization has to how such categorization clearly violates international law, even if under their municipal laws it is legal, and how such categorization plays a very important role in mobilizing public opinion against refugees, especially given the fact that since international law has no executory frameworks, public opinion in a country is really the only safeguard that we have in terms of ensuring that international law obligations are upheld by countries, especially powerful countries, rich countries like Australia, like the United States, like Western Europe. Having said that, I'll quickly come to the first idea of, and that's leading on from Ms. Bagchi's point about cultural aspects of human rights. Somehow there is this idea, this idea has been propagated, if not overtly then covertly, that there are certain cultures, there are certain countries, and there are certain peoples whose ideas, whose frameworks are not compatible with Western notions of democracy, with Western notions of parliamentary sovereignty, with Western notions of freedom of speech, and with Western notions of gender equality. Now, and that is used to promote a certain bias against refugees, again, as I said, if not overtly, then covertly. At the same time, nowadays especially, they are careful never to make it a race issue or an ethnicity issue. They make it a culture issue, because somehow we have to pay lip service to the idea that all cultures are equal and equally worthy of respect. At the same time, devise policies which are in fact racist in nature, because you are denying that there are certain, you are asserting that there are certain people from certain parts of the world who in almost a biological sense are not fit to be citizens of the Golden West, or citizens who can be compatible with Western cultures and the way the West is. And that is something that tends to reflect itself in Australia, that it tends to reflect itself in the statements that their ministers make. And you are forgetting here that a refugee is someone by definition who has been deprived of a lot of basic things in life. He is somebody who's fleeing for his life. He probably doesn't have the same amount, the same chances at life that that other people do. And that deprivation is the crux of what makes him a refugee. And the moment you assert that his culture is what makes him incompatible with my country rather than that deprivation, you are not accounting for that deprivation. And you are attributing a characteristic to an entire ethnic nationality, to an entire region, which is probably not, which is not a very subtle way to go about things, which is not a very nuanced way to go about things. Secondly, when you talk about security issues, leading on from these cultural incompatibilities, now refugees are routinely categorized as security threats. We all know what happened in Paris, but and in the clamor for calling to close borders, everybody's forgotten that most of the terrorists who were there in the Paris attacks were indeed nationals of the European Union, and that is something people forgot when you're calling for when you are looking to close borders. Now, it's in a sense they are they this kind of discourse allows the public to tolerate behavior towards refugees which you would never tolerate in which you would not tolerate if the government behaved in a similar manner with your fellow citizens or with somebody who you don't deem to be a security threat. Now, because they are deemed to be security threats, because the discourse is that they are seen to be security threats, the categorization is almost subhuman, so governments get away with routinely treating them in a manner that they wouldn't. For example, in Australia, they are kept apart from the media, they are kept apart from lawyers in what are known as offshore processing centers. Now, these offshore processing centers are remote islands to which nobody has any access except government agencies. Now, if you're not giving lawyers access to it, if you're not giving media access to it, if you're not giving the general public the chance to see refugees on your soil, how are you going to build a human rights discourse, or how are you going to give them an actual picture of what is actually going on? How are you going to uphold the rights of the refugees which are guaranteed to them by the Refugee Convention of 51 and the protocol following it in 67, because it says that they need legal help. It says that they can't be kept away from legal help, most importantly, and you're doing that. The third thing is that you're dubiously keeping them away by excising your own shores. In 2001, Australia passed an amendment to its Migration Act, which says that certain parts of its territories, the Ashmore Islands, the Cocos Keeling Islands, and the Christmas Islands, are now deemed to be excised territories. Even though they are sovereign Australian soil, they are now deemed to be excised territories, which means that people who land in them, and these are normally the first point of contact for refugees arriving by boats. What happens is that if refugees arrive here, then they are not going to be processed as refugees. They are going to be processed as something called an unlawful non-citizen. Now, legally speaking, the term unlawful non-citizen has very little meaning. Either you are a refugee or you're not a refugee. International law doesn't really allow you to indulge in these created colorable categories, which you are doing by passing laws which make it impossible for refugees to land and then claim rights as refugees. Now, you have the right to determine whether they are refugees or not, but at the same time, you can't determine their status before actually determining their status, and that's what Australia is doing in a way. Before you land on our soil, we have determined who you are if you land in these areas. In 2013, they added on to that further, saying that anybody who arrives in any part of Australia by boat is also considered an unauthorized maritime arrival, and they are also categorized as unlawful non-citizens. Now, again, you are dubiously indulging in these categories which international law doesn't allow you to indulge in. In a sense, the body of the refugee is where the border resides. In a sense, it doesn't matter whether you're landing on sovereign Australian soil, whether you're landing somewhere else, whether you come by boat. They want to exclude who you are as a person, and that they will do, regardless of whether you are following internationally mandated legal procedures or not. And it's impossible, and there are layers of refugee proofing that the global north does. And this is the last and the most insurmountable layer in a certain sense, because if you are excluded from a territory by the mere fact that you exist, then there is no way you actually can come and claim asylum in that territory. And all that leads me to my last point about the way refugees are seen world over generally, and the terms that we use. One of the terms that is used is, one of the pillars of refugee law is burden sharing. And that has now given way to a more politically correct term called responsibility sharing. Now, but years and years of use of the term burden sharing has ensured that you're looking at refugees as burdens. And policies like this are obviously meant to do that, to get you to look at refugees as burdens, policies and discourses. One of the major reasons that the West gives for not entertaining refugees on its soil, amongst a lot of other reasons, is an economic one. They say that it is more economical, and you get the term, actually it's been used by a lot of academics, including Peter Schuck. The term is bang for buck. You get more bang for buck if you keep them in developing nations rather than developed nations. Like, for the same amount of money, you can take care of 10 more refugees. But they also forget that sometimes simply hosting refugees on your soil, sometimes simply having the problem in front of your citizens, make sure that there is a certain kind of there's a certain kind of training, there's a certain kind of empathy, sympathy that you evoke for these people, which would otherwise not be possible if these people were not on your soil, being looked at by your citizens themselves, because your citizens have no real idea of what's going on. And to conclude, even if I have to warn people about, we have to, like, we have to stay clear of the problems of attributing easy causal relations. We also have to understand that the present crisis in Syria and Lebanon is largely a creation of Western policies in that region. Having said that, as I said, you have to stay clear of the perils of casuistry that's there. The last question, which I would like to end, is this: hosting refugees is not merely a financial issue. Hosting refugees is also a social issue, because there are problems of integration. Now, which society has the optimal resources to take on this kind of responsibility? East Timor, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, most of Africa, or places like Australia? Thank you.